On April the 22nd, 2026, three presidents met in Niamey. No cameras from Western outlets, no headline. They signed an aviation agreement that connected three landlocked capitals for the first time in history. 4 days later, Mali was burning. The press flew in. Cameras pointed at smoke. Every outlet ran the same story. AES in crisis, Kidal falling, the alliance on the edge. They missed everything. Because while the world was watching one city burn, Ibrahim Traore was signing the agreements that will outlast every battle in the Sahel. A $900 million development bank, already operational. A regional airline, routes confirmed. 1,000 wells being drilled across Niger. A security partnership with Somalia. A country that flew its interior minister to Ouagadougou to learn from a man the Western press calls a threat. This is not the story they told you. This is phase 2. And if you have ever been told that Africa cannot build its own future without foreign permission, what you are about to hear is the answer they never wanted you to find. April 25th, 2026, 4:56 in the morning. Coordinated attacks across 6 cities in Mali, and the press mobilized within the hour. Cameras, live feeds, breaking news banners in 4 languages. Every outlet that had ignored the Sahel for 3 years suddenly found its correspondents, its analysts, its retired generals willing to explain on air why the alliance of Sahel states was collapsing. They were not watching the right week. Because between April the 22nd and May 8th, the same 8 days the media spent dissecting every kilometer of contested Malian territory, Ibrahim Traore's government and its AES partners were executing a sequence of agreements that had nothing to do with the battlefield. 4 of them, each one aimed at a different pillar of what analysts have begun calling the dependency architecture, the interlocking system of financial, logistical, and security arrangements that kept West Africa tied to external approval for the previous 6 decades. The first signature landed on April 22nd. Records indicate that representatives from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger gathered in Niamey to formalize the AES regional airline, a carrier with confirmed routes connecting Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou. 3 capital cities, 1 fleet, no transit hub in Paris. This matters more than it sounds. For decades, flying between AES capitals often required routing through Charles de Gaulle. The price, the delay, the dependency. Documents reviewed by regional aviation correspondents confirmed that the Niamey signing established both operational authority and an initial route structure, making the airline not a proposal but a scheduled reality. The press did not cover it. They were watching the Northern Corridor. But the airline was not the largest move of that week. In December 2025, the Alliance of Sahel States had quietly capitalized a new institution, the BCID AES Bank, a regional development bank seeded with $895 million in committed capital. By April of 2026, according to regional finance briefings reviewed by this channel, the institution had moved from capitalization to operational status. Disbursements, project pipelines, a credit architecture that does not require an IMF structural adjustment program as a precondition for funding. $895 million. Operational. Built specifically so that the next infrastructure project in Ouagadougou does not begin with a call to Washington. Who noticed? Almost no one. The cameras were still in Mali. May 7th. Burkina Faso's capital received the Interior Minister of Somalia, a country that flew its senior security official to Ouagadougou not to offer aid but to learn. Reports confirmed the visit produced a formal counterterrorism partnership framework. Somalia, which has spent 15 years at the center of international security interventions, traveling to study the AES model. That is not a footnote. That is a signal about which direction influence is moving. Then, May 8th, Niger announced a program to drill 1,000 wells. Not wells alone, but integrated systems with retention reservoirs and micro-catchment structures designed, according to government technical documents, to stimulate localized rainfall patterns. 1,000 installations. A sovereign water infrastructure program at scale, financed without external conditionality. 1 week, 4 agreements. 0 press conferences covered by the outlets that spent the same period broadcasting from the front lines. The dependency architecture survives on invisibility. Not its own, but the invisibility of its alternatives. When a regional airline gets signed on the same morning that 6 cities are under attack, the airline disappears. That is not an accident. That is how the architecture defends itself. But the airline was only one signature. What came next was worth nearly $900 million, and it was specifically designed to make the IMF's grip on the Sahel irrelevant. Stop here for one moment. The Alliance of Sahel States built a development bank, $900 million in starting capital. Operational since December 2025. No IMF conditions, no World Bank governance requirements. Just 3 nations pooling sovereign resources into a single institution designed to finance what the old system was designed to prevent. That is one of 4 pillars activated in the same week the cameras were pointing elsewhere. The third pillar is the one that will explain why Somalia's interior minister flew to Ouagadougou. Stay with this. 2 capitals, then 3. That was the calculation. When the Alliance of Sahel States signed the Regional Airline Agreement on April 21st and 22nd, 2026, at the 3rd Civil Aviation Days Conference in Niamey, most international observers filed it under logistics. They were wrong. According to official conference records, the agreement creates the first direct air corridor linking Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou, 3 landlocked capitals that had never been connected without routing through a foreign hub. Think about what that means in practice. Before this agreement, a minister flying from Bamako to Ouagadougou boarded a plane to Paris, Casablanca, or Brussels first. Every diplomatic meeting, every security coordination call, every sensitive document transfer routed through infrastructure the dependency architecture built and still controls. That is not a travel inconvenience. That is how you slow down a sovereignty movement without firing a single shot. You make the geography work against it. The airline breaks that geometry, and it is not alone. Niger is simultaneously developing its own national carrier. Documents indicate that a unified biometric identification system and a harmonized e-passport framework are already in deployment across AES territory. The same week the cameras were pointing at Kidal, the alliance was building the connective tissue of a state. Not a rebel movement, not a transitional government, but a functioning sovereign architecture with its own mobility layer. This is what strategic patience looks like at the infrastructure level. Pillar 2 arrived in December 2025, 6 months before Niamey, and it hit with a different kind of force. The BCID-AII, the Alliance's new investment and development bank, opened with authorized capital of 500 billion CFA francs. That converts to nearly $900 million. Pooled by 3 nations simultaneously. No precedent for this inside ECOWAS. No comparable coordination in the Sahel's post-independence history. The design was deliberate. Records indicate the bank was structured from inception to finance projects without IMF conditionalities. No structural adjustment requirements, no forced privatization clauses, no governance benchmarks set by institutions in Washington or Geneva. The architects understood what they were building against. Consider the context the IMF itself provided. In spring 2026, IMF reporting indicated that more than 1/3 of African nations were in active debt distress, with average domestic interest rates across the continent running at 8.8% annually. The old system was not failing by accident. It was functioning exactly as designed, keeping sovereign investment expensive, keeping external dependency cheap. The BCID-AES is the counter-architecture, and it does not stand alone. Records show the bank operates in coordination with the AES Chamber of Commerce, established in the same phase, alongside a series of agricultural trade agreements that are systematically replacing informal bilateral arrangements with formal institutional frameworks. 4 pillars, 1 architecture. Each component reinforcing the others, each one invisible in isolation, each one essential to the whole. You are watching the same week the cameras were pointing elsewhere. That is not an accident either. It never is. The dependency architecture has always understood that visibility is a form of control. Keep the attention on the crisis. Keep the camera on the conflict. The infrastructure gets signed while the world is counting casualties somewhere else. But you are here. That matters. Because the people who built the old system counted on the movement having no memory, no long view, no audience paying attention across multiple news cycles at once. Every time you track what actually happened, not what was amplified, but what was signed and built and activated, you become part of the counter-architecture yourself. The airline connects three capitals. The bank removes the financial chokehold, 2 pillars down. But the most unexpected move of Phase 2 did not come from inside the AES at all. It came from a country that spent 15 years taking orders from outside and finally stopped. Somalia spent 15 years at the center of the largest international security intervention in modern African history. AMISOM, EU training missions, American drone corridors, 15,000 foreign troops at peak deployment, funded by institutions that called it humanitarian. On May 7, 2026, Somalia's interior minister boarded a flight to Ouagadougou, not to offer assistance, to learn. That visit produced a formal counterterrorism partnership framework. What they brought back was not weapons or funding, it was a model. And that model is the most dangerous thing the old system has ever faced. The airline connects three capitals. The bank removes the financial chokehold. But the move that nobody in the international press predicted, the move that rewrote the entire narrative of Phase 2, came from a country that spent 15 years inside the very interventionist model that the AES was dismantling. On May 7, 2026, Somalia's interior minister flew to Ouagadougou, not to offer assistance, not to attend a summit. He flew to study. That detail matters. For 15 years, Somalia was the centerpiece of international security intervention, AMISOM deployments, European Union training missions, American drone operations across its northern and central corridors. Reports reviewed from African Union observers confirmed that Somalia received more external security architecture per square kilometer than almost any nation on the continent during that period. And then its interior minister flew to Burkina Faso to take notes. The visit produced a formal counterterrorism partnership framework between Somalia and the AS bloc. What they came to learn, according to statements from the Ouagadougou meetings, was the AES doctrine itself. Local forces, minimal external dependency, sovereignty-first security design. The exact inverse of what Somalia had lived through for a generation. This is not aid flowing from a wealthy country to a struggling one. This is knowledge moving horizontally between equals across a continent that the old system always assumed needed to look outward for answers. When a country that received intervention for 15 years boards a plane to study a so-called pariah state, the direction of influence has shifted. The camera has turned around. The following day, May 8, 2026, Niger announced its 1,000 wells program. The numbers alone do not capture what this represents. These are not simple boreholes. Government technical documents describe integrated systems. Retention reservoirs, microcatchment structures, designs calibrated to stimulate localized rainfall patterns across Niger's most arid zones. Records indicate the program is financed without a single clause of external conditionality attached. No IMF performance benchmarks. No World Bank structural requirement. Sovereign water infrastructure at national scale, funded on sovereign terms. Pause on that week for a moment. The BCID AAS Bank, operational since December 2025, holds $895 million in founding capital, 500 billion CFA, with no external lending conditions baked into its charter. The Air AES agreement, signed the same week as the Kidal offensive drew every camera south, now connects three AES capitals. The Somalia Partnership Framework establishes a new model for security knowledge transfer. And the Niger Wells program addresses food and water sovereignty at the infrastructure level. Mobility, capital, security knowledge, water, 4 dependencies, 4 removals, 1 week. This is not coincidence. This is architecture responding to itself. And then there is the mining. In Mali, the government renegotiated contracts with Barrick Gold and other major operators. According to official government decrees, Mali now holds a minimum 35% equity stake in all active mining operations. Several foreign operators were expelled from the country entirely in 2025. In Burkina Faso, Traore imposed a 40% state participation requirement on all mining concessions. Canadian firm Endeavour Mining, formerly Semaphore, departed under those conditions, and gold revenue flows redirected toward the domestic budget rather than outward to holding companies registered in other jurisdictions. In Niger, uranium exports to Orano, the French state-linked nuclear fuel company, were halted. Documents confirm Niger demanded sovereign pricing control over its uranium, the mineral that powered France's energy grid for decades and was never, until now, subject to AES pricing authority. 3 countries, 3 minerals, 3 renegotiations, all within an 18-month window. The old system processed each of these as a separate crisis, an isolated provocation, a diplomatic incident requiring a response. It was not. Reports from regional economic analysts confirm what the timeline makes obvious. This was one coordinated strategy executed across 3 sovereign governments at 3 simultaneous pressure points. Disruption is reactive. What you are watching is architecture, deliberate, sequenced, and designed to replace something rather than merely resist it. The question is not whether the dependency structure is being dismantled. The evidence is already in the record. The question is what replaces it. And that answer has been hiding in plain sight inside 3 financial decisions that the IMF would very much prefer you never examine too closely. 3 countries, 3 minerals, 18 months. Mali renegotiated Barrick Gold and claimed 35% equity in every mine. Burkina Faso imposed 40% state participation and expelled operators who refused. Niger halted uranium exports to France's state-linked nuclear company and demanded sovereign pricing on a mineral that powered French reactors for decades. The press called each one an isolated incident. They were not. They were the same decision made 3 times on 3 separate resource bases in coordinated sequence. What comes next is why the IMF's own data proves the timing was not random. The 3 financial decisions the IMF would prefer you never examine too closely. They are not isolated policy choices. They are load-bearing walls inside something much larger. Start with the currency. 14 African nations still operate under the CFA franc, a monetary system pegged to the euro, with operational frameworks that have historically routed through external treasury mechanisms. That structure is not incidental. It is the financial choke point. Reports from regional monetary analysts confirm that Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are now actively developing a common monetary instrument independent of the CFA architecture. The timeline is not yet fixed. The direction is not in question. This is where the BCID AES bank stops being a bank and starts being something else entirely. According to IMF Spring 2026 data, more than 1/3 of African nations are in active debt distress. Average domestic interest rates across the continent sit at 8.8% annually. The bank, $895 million, zero IMF conditionality, was not built to compete with that system. It was built to make that system irrelevant. There is a difference. One approach fights the choke point, the other routes around it. The airline does the same thing at a different layer. Historically, travel between Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey required transiting through Paris or Casablanca, not because of geography, but because that is how the regional transit infrastructure was designed. The new AES airline collapses that routing. It connects 3 capitals directly on sovereign terms: mobility, capital, security knowledge, water, 4 dependencies, 4 removals. The airline was never just about travel. Then came January 2025. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger formally exited ECOWAS, the regional bloc that had served as the institutional framework for West African economic and security coordination. The Confederation of AES states was declared as a parallel architecture. ECOWAS threatened sanctions. The AES absorbed the pressure and continued building. None of the predicted collapse scenarios materialized. Records from regional economic observers confirm what the 12-month timeline shows. By May 2026, what materialized instead of collapse was Phase 2. The airline route in operation, the bank dispersing capital, the mining renegotiations, Mali at 35%, Burkina Faso at 40%, Niger's uranium terms restructured. funding a sovereign capital base that the bank then channels back into the infrastructure the airline connects. Each piece makes the others more defensible. That is not coincidence, that is design. You are watching something that the system counted on going unnoticed, because the old system processed each move as a separate provocation, a diplomatic incident, an isolated economic decision requiring a calibrated response. It never recognized the moves as a single document being written simultaneously across 5 surfaces. The mining revenue funds the bank's capital base. The bank funds the infrastructure. The airline connects the infrastructure. The Somalia visit, knowledge flowing horizontally between sovereign governments, not vertically from donor to recipient, showed that the security knowledge layer was being built the same way. And the Niger wells protect food security so that the currency transition does not trigger a food crisis that unravels the rest. Documents suggest this is the mistake the dependency architecture has always made. It responds to symptoms rather than reading the architecture beneath them. By the time a system recognizes it is being bypassed rather than challenged, the bypass is already operational. The Analytica case is now closed. The evidence is in the record. The renegotiations happened, the bank was capitalized, the airline took flight, the wells were drilled, the ECOWAS exit was absorbed. Phase 2 did not announce itself, it simply became real. This is what sovereignty looks like when it stops asking for permission. 3 things happened in those 8 days that almost nobody reported together. 4 sovereignty agreements were signed. The media pointed its cameras at Kidal, and the dependency architecture survived, not through force, but through the oldest trick in the system, making the alternative invisible. That invisibility is the architecture. The airline does not just move people, it moves people without asking permission from a hub never designed to serve them. The bank does not just hold capital, it holds capital outside the accounting systems built to keep it flowing outward. The mining renegotiations do not just recover revenue, they establish a precedent that the terms of extraction are not permanent, and the wells simply work. Each pillar makes the others more defensible. Remove one, and the others still stand. That is not resistance, that is replacement. And then Somalia's interior minister flew to Ouagadougou to study the model. Stop and sit with that. The direction of influence reversed. Knowledge stopped flowing only from outside in. One government came to another, not for aid, not for loans, not for security guarantees written in someone else's language, but to understand how a framework for self-determination actually functions on the ground. The student became the reference point. If you have ever been told that African governments cannot build lasting institutions without external scaffolding, what you just watched is the evidence that was kept out of frame. You did not stumble into this video. You searched, or someone sent it, or something in you already suspected the story was larger than the headline allowed. You are not a passive witness. You are part of the small group paying attention when attention is the rarest resource of all. If this video clarified something you already felt but could not articulate, hit like. Not for the algorithm, because clarity deserves a signal. Then share it with one person still working from the incomplete version of this story. One share is one counter-visibility act. The dependency architecture banks on silence. Break it. And in the comments. Drop phase 2, your country. And one thing this video shifted in how you see what sovereignty actually requires. Not in theory, but in infrastructure. Let's see who's actually been paying attention. There's one more layer most people have never heard explained clearly. The financial architecture that made the AES transition possible, and the battle over a currency that was never supposed to be questioned. That video is already waiting for you.